Last winter, when that whole Richard Spencer punching incident occurred, and a debate ensued over under what circumstances it's justified, if ever, to punch your political opponent's lights out simply because his views are abhorrent and evil, I probably should have posted a YouTube video on that subject at that time. After all, I got into arguments all over social media, mainly Facebook, pointing out to people the folly of this precedent that they were setting by defending the punching of Richard Spencer, even advocating further attacks like that in the future. There were many arguments that I made against it, all of which I continue to subscribe to this day, such as the fact that that kind of tactic can only backfire because it will, in all likelihood, enable the victim of the attack to portray himself and his cause as the victim and the martyr. Of course, Richard Spencer did that later that same day, posting a video to YouTube and probably other media as well, basically talking about how his opponents were so angry and hateful and intolerant that they couldn't even let him peacefully exercise his First Amendment right to free speech on a Washington, D.C. sidewalk. No, they just had to box him in the side of the head. So great was their hatred and intolerance for his point of view. I also argue that it could backfire by motivating Richard Spencer and his disciples to engage in similar acts of violence in the future against people like me. If it's okay to physically attack your opponents simply because you dislike or disapprove of or abhor the substance of your opponent's viewpoints, what's to stop them from doing the same thing to you? I'm sure Richard Spencer and his followers and all of his sympathizers out there believe that the viewpoints of the rest of us are just as evil as we think their viewpoints are. So what's to stop them from doing the same thing to us? So, in a way, maybe it's just as well that I didn't post a video on that subject at the time. Maybe it actually worked out just fine for me to wait until, unfortunately, tragically, the very things that I feared might come to pass actually came to pass. And I would say it looks like that's more or less what has happened in Charlottesville, Virginia, just the other day. When a white nationalist rally was confronted by Antifa protesters and other anti-racist protesters, and just degenerated into disturbing political violence, culminating in an attack that I would consider terroristic, in which a man named James Fields drove through a crowd of his political opponents, drove through a crowd of the anti-racist protesters, knocking people out of the way, injuring 19 people, and tragically killing one woman, Heather Heyer, a 31-year-old woman in the prime of her life, my own age. Now, it goes without saying that this was a despicable, reprehensible act. It shouldn't even need to be said at this point, and God knows more than enough other people have said it. So I prefer to focus on the aspect of this situation that may not be getting as much attention as it deserves. This kind of political violence is decidedly predictable, maybe even inevitable, after you set a precedent whereby people are now allowed to initiate physical violence, whether through punches, shootings, or running people over with cars, simply because of how much they deplore the substance of their opponent's viewpoints. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the kind of thing we should actually expect. If we're going to go around saying it's okay to punch someone like Richard Spencer in the side of the head, not when he's attacking someone physically or poised to attack someone physically, but when he's just standing on a sidewalk, giving an interview, spouting his hateful nonsense, if you're going to say it's okay to box him in a situation such as that one, what's to stop someone like him or any of his supporters from saying, okay, you guys think it's cool to punch us just because you hate what we believe in and what we stand for, whether we're actually attacking you in the moment or not? Fine. I'll give you a taste of your own medicine. I'm going to take my car and run some of you over at a demonstration. And when I do, don't complain about it because you are the ones who said 6 or 7 months ago that it's okay to attack your opponents physically as long as you consider their viewpoints really, really, really evil. What else can we expect? Now, I think it should go without saying that Antifa protester who, actually I shouldn't say he punched Richard Spencer's lights out last winter because he didn't even knock Spencer all the way down to the ground, let alone knock him out cold or anything like that. But sure, the guy's heart was in the right place. Sure, he's right to deplore what Richard Spencer represents. It's inherently deplorable. But if he's not about to attack someone or in the process of attacking someone, then you don't have certainly the legal right, and in my view, the moral right to attack him physically, simply because you deplore what he believes and what he's saying. That's no good. It's a double-edged sword. It can backfire all too easily because two can play at that game. In fact, forget two, many can play at that game. Any can play at that game. And what we're seeing now, what we saw in Charlottesville just last weekend, was an example of Spencer supporters playing at that same game. Only difference being they're ratcheting up the violence. Now let's remember what kind of political moment we live in, ladies and gentlemen, the political climate in American society today. The country seems to be more polarized politically than it's been probably in the past 50 years. Probably more polarized now than it has been since the late 1960s. Fortunately, American society still has yet to see a return to those levels of violence, political violence at least. But the country is so polarized now, with people dug in so firmly on opposing sides of the political spectrum, those who take an interest in politics at any rate, and with people increasingly so loath to even listen to each other and hear out each other's points of view, that when you start introducing political violence into the mix and saying it's okay to attack your opponents physically, not when you're defending yourself against their attack, but simply to express your abhorrence of their beliefs, what's to stop them from doing likewise? What's to stop anyone from doing likewise? That's not the kind of precedent we need to be setting. Just last year, we saw the massacre of police officers in Dallas, Texas. Earlier that same year, 2016, we started to see violence popping off at Donald Trump's presidential campaign rallies. Just a couple of months ago, we saw a left-wing protester or radical or whatever you want to call him try to assassinate several Republican members of Congress at a baseball practice in Alexandria, Virginia. The last thing American society needs is more violence, political or otherwise. It doesn't need any more of this. So let's all take a deep breath and calm down before we start trying to make excuses for, or worse yet, advocate violence against even those who hold some of the most noxious and despicable political views known to man. It's not enough that they simply be evil and say evil things and advocate evil things in order for us to be justified in committing violence against them. The bar needs to be set higher than that. Now don't get it twisted. I'm not a pacifist. I'm not someone who believes violence is never justified, not even political violence. The United States, for example, owes its very existence to the American Revolution, an extended act of political violence. But when it comes to this kind of low-level grassroots violence, rather than the kind of organized, disciplined violence that a military war effort represents, whether it's the American Revolution or the Second World War, in which the United States and its allies defeated European and Japanese fascism, which is an example that a friend of mine cited on Facebook just yesterday. When you're talking about grassroots violence, paramilitary or non-military violence of this nature, it's important to trammel it and limit it using the principle of self-defense. And I think that only applies, that right of self-defense only attaches, as lawyers would put it, in situations where a person is in imminent danger of death or serious bodily injury by an attacker. That wasn't the case when Richard Spencer got boxed in the side of the head on that Washington, D.C. sidewalk last January. However, there are any number of other situations where that could be the case, involving not necessarily Richard Spencer himself, who I suspect wouldn't have the balls to commit any act of violence against anyone himself, but maybe some of his supporters or sympathizers, like-minded individuals out there. Think of the Charleston Church massacre a couple of years ago, when Dylann Roof marched into the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and gunned down 9 innocent African Americans in cold blood because of the color of their skin. Now there's a situation where the right to self-defense certainly would have attached. If any of those churchgoers had happened to be armed at the time, with a gun for example, as soon as they saw Dylann Roof pull out a gun, I think they would have been justified, and the law agrees that they would have been justified, in opening fire on him. If somebody comes at you like that, trying to commit an act of violence against you for no good reason, no justification, no provocation, by all means, you can lick shots. You're legally justified in doing so. You're morally justified in doing so. Boom, bye, in a white nationalist's head. If it really is legitimately in self-defense. I'm not saying that violence against Richard Spencer or the like is never justified under any circumstances. I would never say that. But it wasn't justified under the circumstances that prevailed on that Washington, D.C. sidewalk last winter. I think violence is justified in some situations, but in most cases, it is not. In most cases, at the very best, it does more harm than good. And so let's all keep that in mind. And let's, all of us, across the political spectrum, ratchet down the rhetoric, ratchet down the tension and the anger. And even when it comes to people like Richard Spencer, whose views don't deserve to be heard out and don't deserve to be taken seriously, even then, the last thing we need is more violence. We need to do a better job of distinguishing cases where violence is justified from those where it is not. we need to increase the peace.